What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another Elden Ring video. Now, a couple weeks ago I made a video going over what I thought, in my opinion, was the best spirit summons in Elden Ring, and that video has since gotten over 500,000 views, so I figured why not, let's make another one. I got a lot of feedback in that previous video. A lot of people were recommending me some spirit ashes that I didn't have in that video, so I've been doing a lot of experimenting to try to find out what the best ones were in all of Elden Ring. So in this list I'm showcasing the top ones that I found based off of all my experiments. And I included a couple of the fan favorites that didn't make it in my previous video as well. And this time I'm putting them in a tier list instead of just a straight up top 10, because it really just depends on your build and these specific situations. Some of these spirits succeed in certain areas that others might not, and some of them can work really well with your specific play style, and it just depends on the specific situation, so that's why we're doing a tier list this time. And just a heads up, I leveled every single one of these up to level 9 so that it was an equal playing field for every single one of these spirits, and I had them all go up against similar bosses, and I put them in 1v1 situations to see how they do on their own without my help, to make it as equal as possible. And so this video isn't like 2 hours long. Let's go ahead and just jump right into it. So to start off this list, the very first one we have is the Ancestral Follower. They come in at 63 FP cost, and this is a spirit summon that you can get pretty early on in the game, and they are good throughout the entire game. Early, mid, late game, they're just an all-around good follower. Unlike most of the ranged spirits, the Ancestral Follower actually does a great job of actually hitting his target. A lot of the archers will shoot their arrows and just completely miss, which is one of my biggest pet peeves with the archers. So the Ancestral Follower actually hits his target most of the time, which is a huge plus. If something gets up in his face, he can pull out an axe and he can do a high amount of damage. He's really good for the boss fights in those big open rooms. He just does constant DPS to the boss, and he's just an overall really good follower to have. Highly recommend him, and I'm putting him up at A tier. So next up, we have the fan favorite, the Jellyfish. I couldn't tell you how many comments I had in my last video about how my video just sucked because the Jellyfish wasn't on the list, and how dare I not have the Jellyfish. The Jellyfish is the best one. So for these experiments, I took the best out of 3 boss fights. I had each one of these spirits fight the bosses 3 times, and I took the best out of the 3 to show you guys in this gameplay. And what you're seeing here is the best out of the 3 for the Jellyfish, and the Jellyfish got absolutely slaughtered. Like in my testing, I had them go up against different bosses, and the Jellyfish just doesn't cut it. The Jellyfish might be pretty good early game because that's one of the first ones you get. They come in at a measly 31 FP cost, so they're pretty cheap. They're pretty good in certain situations. For example, they fly over top of things, so like they hover over top of lava, and they're good against dragon AoE attacks because they sort of just hover over top of AoE attacks. So they're pretty good early game because they do pretty good poison damage. So if it was early game, I'd probably put them in B tier, but late game, the Jellyfish is just so bad. I'm putting the Jellyfish at D tier, and I don't care if I get a ton of hate in the comments. That's what I got from my testing results. The Jellyfish just doesn't cut it, so putting the Jellyfish at D tier. So next up we have the Ancient Dragon Knight Kristoff. They come in at 108 FP cost. Now the Ancient Dragon Knight is actually one of my favorites. I think they're pretty cool. They have a shield so they can block a lot of damage. They actually are pretty good at close to mid-range because they have this really cool lightning attack. If something's a little bit out of reach for the knight, will just point his spear up into the sky and shoot this like lightning attack over and over and over. It's really good against bosses, and if you level up the Ancient Dragon Knight, I think he's definitely one to carry you through most of the game. So I'm putting him up at A tier. So next up we have the Azula Beastman. They come in at 102 FP cost. Now these guys you aren't going to get until later in the game. These are one of the final spirit ashes that you can find, so you're not really going to get the chance to play with them too much unless you do a new game plus. And it's a real shame because these guys are really good. They're really aggressive. There's 2 of them, and each of them have a high amount of health points, and they can just take a lot of hits. They can do a lot of damage, and they're really good, so I'm putting them up at A tier. So moving on to the Black Knife Tiche. Now the Black Knife Tiche comes in at 132 FP cost, which is insane. But the Black Knife Tiche is the first one on our list going straight up to S tier because the Black Knife is just nuts. she absolutely melts bosses' health bars. She's really hard to hit, she's constantly dodging and bobbing and weaving and avoiding attacks, and her special ability just wrecks things. This spirit helped me in so many situations fighting bosses, and I can't recommend her enough. She is one of the best ones in the game by far. She was actually doing so well that she ruined some of my experiment and she killed the boss. I was having all these spirits fight the same exact boss so it would be an equal playing field, but then she actually killed the boss, so then I had to go find new bosses for some of these other spirits to fight because she just did so good of a job that she killed the boss on her own. And this was a late game boss. This was a late game dungeon that you could go into. So highly recommend the Black Knife Tiche, one of the best in the game. So next up is kind of a 2-for-1. We have the Banished Knight Engvall and the Banished Knight Oleg. Now they both come in at 100 FP cost a piece, so they cost the same amount. Now the Banished Knight Engvall wasn't available when I made my first video. They didn't become available until the latest patch, and they're about the same. For my experiments, they do about the same amount of damage. They have close to the same amount of health pool, and you know, their attacks are pretty close to one another. I couldn't really tell much of a difference between the two of them, so I'm sort of just going to group them together in this ranking. I really couldn't tell much of a difference between the two of them. They really did about the same. So I'm going to rank them both at A tier. They do a great job of staggering bosses and knocking them down so you can get that special move off onto the boss. And they do a good job at drawing aggro and doing a lot of DPS, and they're both really good to have, and I highly recommend both of them. So next up we have the Battlemage either Hugues or Hugues. I think the H is silent. Now the Battlemage was actually recommended to me by one of you guys in the latest video, and I didn't know that this guy existed, and once I got him, he's actually pretty good. He comes in at 122 FP cost. He has a combination of just physical attacks and magic attacks. He's pretty good. I mean, I don't really have any complaints with him. I do think he's a bit expensive. I don't think he's worth his FP cost, but I mean, if you have a mage build or something, he might work good with you in that regard. It really just depends on what kind of boss you're fighting, but I think he's good enough to put up an A tier as well. So next up we have the Bloodhound Knight. Now the Bloodhound Knight, I had some mixed results with the Bloodhound Knight because the Bloodhound Knight can deal a lot of damage and he can deal a lot of bleed damage. So if you have a bleed build, he's really good at working in tandem with bleed builds because you can just proc a lot of bleed over and over and over. But the Bloodhound Knight is a bit of a glass cannon. If the Bloodhound Knight gets caught in any sort of combo or gets hit in any way, shape, or form, he just has so little health, he just can't take much damage. He comes in at 95 FP, so he's a little bit cheaper than some of these other ones, but he just isn't as good as some of the other ones. He's not as tanky in my opinion, and I'm putting him at B tier. Like I said, he's good with bleed characters, but on his own, he just was kind of meh, so that's why I'm putting him at B. Now next up, we have the Cleanrot Knight Finlay. Now Finlay is apparently a female because in my last video, I said that it was a dude, and a lot of people were pointing out that this is in fact a girl. So the Cleanrot Knight is a girl, and she's kind of meh. You know, she's one of the later spirits you get in the game. She comes in at 127 FP cost, so it's one of the most expensive in the game. But in a lot of my tests in these 1v1 against bosses, she wasn't doing that good. Like, she kept struggling a little bit. She's a good kind of support character. She has some good Scarlet Rot abilities and she has some good ranged attacks, but I'm actually going to rank her lower than what I did in the last video, and I think she's just at B tier because at 127 FP, I think she's just too expensive. She just isn't as good as her FP cost requires, and she just wasn't performing as well as some of these other ashes, so I'm putting her at B. So next up, we have the Crystalian Ashes. Now this crystal statue girl, she's really good if she's going up against anything that doesn't do physical damage. She's good against like magic or fire or anything that isn't physical. If she goes up against something that does a lot of blunt damage or something that can just bash her over and over, she's going to die really quickly. That's the bit of the downside, but if you're going up against something that doesn't do a lot of physical damage, this is one of the best ones in the game. She can just take so many hits. Like, I was just sitting back and watching her just truck all kinds of damage. So she's a bit of a tank. I've noticed that she misses a lot with her like little ranged attack. She'll throw her little disc and just miss time and time again. So she's fairly inaccurate, but she can tank a lot of damage. So I'm going to put her up at A tier. It really just depends on the type of boss boss that you're fighting. So she's pretty good. So next up, we have Dolores the Sleeping Arrow puppet coming in at 87 FP cost. Now I saw a couple YouTube videos talking about how good this puppet was and how it was like breaking the game and it's like the greatest ever. So I decided to check out Dolores for myself, and Dolores is not as good as people are claiming to be. Dolores, I think, kind of sucks. Now Dolores the Sleeping Arrow has the special ability of, you guessed it, firing sleeping arrows. So if enough sleeping arrows make contact with a boss, it can put a boss to sleep, which is extremely handy. The problem is, one, Dolores can't take very many hits, so if a boss aggroes onto Dolores at all, Dolores is probably going to die right away. Two, Dolores is extremely inaccurate. I couldn't tell you how many times I watched Dolores miss a boss that was standing still. And three, I can only get her sleeping arrows to proc on a boss maybe 1 or 2 times out of all my experiments. So when her sleeping arrows do build up and they do put a boss to sleep, that's extremely helpful. It just is very rare for it to happen in my experience. So I think Dolores is overrated, and I'm putting Dolores at C tier. So next up, we have the Greatshield Soldiers. This is one of the ones that I got recommended to me time and time again. Now the Greatshield Soldiers are really good at taking hits. They are really tanky, so if you need something that's good at just drawing the attention of the boss and something that's just holding aggro for a long period of time and that can just stay alive for a long period of time, I highly recommend the Greatshield Soldiers. They're basically just good at taking hits. So if you don't want something to deal a lot of damage and just want to draw the aggro of the boss, go with the Greatshield Soldiers. I think they're pretty good. I'm going to put them up at B tier just because they aren't that great at dealing damage. They're just really good at staying alive. So next up, we have Latenna the Albinauric. Now this is one of the spirits that I overlooked in my last video because I just didn't think she was very good, but since I've leveled her up to level 9, she's actually pretty decent. Now her arrows almost never miss, which is a huge plus, and she basically acts like a stationary turret. Wherever you summon her, she is going to sit there and she isn't going to move, which can be kind of handy. It really depends on the boss. Now when it comes to this character, you want to summon her in a spot that you know she's going to be safe, and she's just going to do constant DPS to the boss, which in those big open environments is really, really good to have. And she does a pretty decent amount of damage on her own without your help. So because she's so accurate and she always hits her targets and she just does constant DPS, and you don't have to worry about her running around and getting hit by multiple things, like wherever you put her, she is going to stay. I'm going to put her at S tier. I think she's probably one of the best archers to have summoned. I think she's one of the best archers in the game, and I think you guys will really like using her. So next up, we have Lhutel the Headless coming in at 104 FP cost. Now, Lhutel the Headless is this big, beefy girl. She can just take hits. She can teleport around. She can throw her spear. She's just really, really good. If you want a tanky character that can stay alive for a long period of time against a boss, something that can take out smaller enemies, she's just an all-around, well-rounded, good spirit to have. And I'm going to put her up at A tier. I think she's, she's on par with a lot of these other ones. She's not good enough to be an S tier, I don't think. She doesn't just straight up annihilate bosses, but she is pretty well rounded. She has some range to her, and she's definitely not going to let you down. So next up, we have the Lone Wolf Ashes. I had a lot of people recommending me the Wolf Ashes as well, probably because the Wolf Ashes are one of the first ones you get in the game. Now, I was a bit disappointed because I thought if I leveled them clear up to level 9, they would actually do pretty good. Now, they are really aggressive, and they draw the aggro of the boss fairly decently. The problem is that they can't take very many hits. If they increase the health pool of the wolves, I think they'd be a lot better. So the problem is that they're so aggressive that they get right up in the boss's face, especially in the late game. These big strong bosses will just wreck them in a couple seconds, and they just didn't perform as good as what I hoped. So early game, they're a pretty good option to have, but late game, they're not the greatest, so I'm going to put them at C tier. So next up, we have the Marionette Soldiers at 67 FP cost. Now, the Marionette Soldiers are pretty good. They just fire a volley of arrows, which is pretty great. They're doing just so much DPS to the boss. It's just constantly taking away at their health. The problem is that they are like mid-range. They're not long range at all, which definitely sucks. If they were long range, I would easily put them up at S tier, but because they have to get so close to the boss, they often die fairly quickly anytime a boss gets angry at them, so that definitely sucks. But the constant DPS they do, I think, is just really, really handy. I'm not going to rank them as high as some of these others, but I definitely don't think they're bad by any means. I think they're good against like medium tier bosses. I mean, if you have these guys, they're definitely worth using, but I'm going to put them at B tier. So next up, we have the Mausoleum Soldiers at 75 FP. Now the Mausoleum Soldiers I talked really highly about in my last video, and I do think that they are really good. These guys can take a lot of hits and they can do a lot of damage, especially if it's like a 1v5 against a boss. They'll just swarm the boss and all be dealing damage to the boss at the same time, and they can deal a lot of damage fast. The problem though with the Mausoleum Soldiers is that I've noticed that they don't really aggro well onto enemies. Like, you have to get the boss to attack them or come really close to them for them to get aggroed onto anything. I summoned them a couple times in different boss fights and they just stood around and didn't do anything. So if you can get them to actually aggro onto a boss or onto something you want to die, they're good to have. But if you're not close to the boss and you summon them far away, or if you summon them and there's a bunch of enemies all around, then they'll get sort of confused. So I'm going to put them down at B tier this time, because they do get a little confused, but when they actually work the way that they're intended to, they would be up at A tier, but I'm going to put them at B. So next up, we have the Mimic tier. Now the Mimic tier did receive a nerf in the latest patch. They cost 660 HP instead of FP, so summoning the Mimic tier will drain from your health. So if you're a big mage build and you don't have that much points put into your health, you have a lot of points put into magic, you might not even be able to summon the Mimic tier, which is one of the few downsides that it has. But the Mimic tier is just awesome. I mean, whatever you have equipped at the time is what the Mimic tier will use. So there's just endless possibilities that you can do with the Mimic tier. You can make the Mimic tier extremely overpowered. If you want to put healing stuff in your inventory, then the Mimic tier will use the healing stuff. If you put bombs or daggers in your inventory slots, then the Mimic tier will use that as well. If you have time to prep before you get into the fight, then you can like put on a certain outfit, activate your Mimic tier, and then just switch all your clothes and your outfits to just have two different builds going on at the same time. What I like to do with my Mimic tier is I'll put on all the beefiest armor that I have so that he's a bit of a tank, and then he'll go in and just draw all the aggro and take a lot of damage. Meanwhile, I have like a bleed build going on, so we're essentially working together with two different builds simultaneously. So the Mimic tier is awesome, endless possibilities. Even after the nerf, I'm still putting them up at S tier just because of all the different potential that the Mimic tier has, and I think they're just one of the best ones in the game. So next up we have the Nightmaiden and Swordstress puppets at 97 FP. Now these guys are actually underrated. I don't see enough people really talking about these two. These two are actually really good because they have some pretty good range to them. From what I noticed, they do a great job of distracting the boss. I kept noticing that one would go in and fight the boss, and then that one would back up, and then the second one would go in and fight the boss. So they kept sort of like alternating on the boss, and it was really confusing the bosses. And they have just a mixture of mid-range abilities. They have that one whip that can like stretch out really far, so they have some mid-range attacks. They throw some magic into the mix, and these two are just really good, especially if you have like a mid-range build, or if you're using arrows or a crossbow or magic. You can sort of sit back, and these two do a great job of drawing the aggro on the boss. So I highly recommend these two, and I'm putting them up at A tier as well. So next up we have the Omenkiller Rollo at 113 FP. Now the Omenkiller is a big beefy guy, sort of similar to a lot of these other guys I have up here at A tier. He's got these two big clubs that do bleed damage, and he can breathe fire, so I think that's pretty awesome. If you have a bleed build, you're just going to be working in tandem with him. He's got these big axes, he's straight up in the boss's face. He's doing bleed damage, you're doing bleed damage, you're going to just wreck a boss together. That in combination with his fire breath, he can catch an enemy on fire so they can take burn damage. He's just an all-around good character to have. He's not as tanky as some of these other guys on this list, but he is pretty good, so I'm putting him in A tier as well. So next up we have the Redmane Knight at 106 FP. Now the Redmane Knight is the best of both worlds. He has a bow that does a lot of damage, and he can also get up close and personal, and he can hit really hard. So if something gets up in his face, he'll pull out his shield, which he can block a lot of attacks and take a lot of damage, and he has this really big greatsword where he can just hit really hard, and he's just really good. If something gets too far away from him, he'll pull out his really big great bow, and he'll do a lot of damage with his special arrows. He is a little bit hit and miss with his accuracy. I have seen him miss a couple times with his arrows, so that's not the greatest, but I do think he does stand out a little bit more than a lot of these other A tier lists, so I'm putting him up at S tier. I think he's just great. He's not going to do as much damage as some of these other ones in S tier, but because he's just the all-around package of just range and close range, and he can stun enemies, I think he's just great. I highly recommend him. Definitely not going to do you wrong. So next up, we have another fan favorite of the Skeletal Militiamen at 44 FP. Now the Militiamen are really good early game and a little bit into mid game. I noticed that they do struggle late game though. The benefit to the Militiamen is that they can essentially live forever. If they die, they can actually reanimate themselves. So if a boss kills them and then gets aggro onto something different, they can just come right back up to life. The problem that I noticed is that yes, they may come back to life forever, but they just don't do enough damage late game. I noticed that they kind of poke and prod at the boss and then get smacked once or twice and then they're already dead. And I also noticed that the big bosses in the late game stuff that have these big AoE attacks, they'll do something onto the ground and like a big slam or a big explosion, and they'll essentially kill them twice. They'll kill them, and then as they're reanimating, they'll just hit them with this big AoE attack and they'll kill them again, and then once they kill their spirit, they're sort of dead for good. So the Militiamen are really good mid game and early game. They're just not that good late game, so I'm going to put them at B tier. So next up, we have the Rotten Stray. Now the Rotten Stray is another recommendation from my previous video. They come in at 35 FP cost, and the benefit to the Rotten Stray is that they do Scarlet Rot damage. So if they're up in an enemy's face, they can inflict them with Scarlet Rot, which will do damage over time. But late game content, the Rotten Stray is really bad. The Rotten Stray can get killed almost instantly. They're a little too aggressive for their own good. The Rotten Stray is definitely a pain in the butt to fight against, but that doesn't translate well to boss fights. You know, they're good early on in mid game, but late game they just struggle. So, you know, I don't think they're as good as people say they are, so I'm putting them at C tier. So next up, we have the Dung Eater at 118 FP cost. Now the Dung Eater is one of the ones that I didn't know existed in my previous video, and the Dung Eater is kind of difficult to get because you have to jump through a lot of hoops and do a lot of side quest stuff to get him. But if you do get him, oh my god, he's like one of the best ones there is. Like, I'm just going to tell you now, he's straight up S tier. He's amazing. He has ranged attacks. He has this like explosion move that does a lot of damage. He has this move that like buffs himself so that his next attack is even stronger. So I've noticed him just take chunks away from boss's health. I had to stop the boss fight early for my experiment because he was going to kill the boss. So I had to actually stop him from doing so. He does struggle against some of those big bosses in those big open rooms because his aggro distance just isn't that far. So you have to keep him in mid to close range combat, but he will just wreck stuff. I think the Dung Eater could easily 1v1 most of these other spirits in this lineup and probably win. I think he would struggle the most with the Mimic tier and the Black Knife Tiche. I would love to see a fight between the Black Knife Tiche and the Dung Eater. That would be really cool to see. But the Dung Eater is just S tier all across the board. Really, really good. Highly recommend him. Go out and get him right away. You will not regret it. And he's just awesome. So finally, we have the Warhawk Ashes coming in at 52 FP. Now the Warhawks are just as annoying to the bosses as they are to you. I'm sure you guys have encountered those stupid hawks that have the little blades on their feet, and that's what this is. They're this hawk that flies around. They're hard to hit because they're constantly flying. They swoop down and smack the boss with their feet, and then they fly away. And this one breathes fire, so it actually just does this big AoE attack and can catch things on fire, so that's cool. And they're just constantly drawing aggro because they do a great job of pissing the boss off. And if you're attacking the boss at the same time, it's just a constant DPS of this thing flying down and smacking them and catching them on fire. And it does a good job of staying alive too, because they're just so hard to hit because they're just flying around up in the sky. So if a boss or something doesn't have an attack where they can look up, then this thing's going to win like 90% of the times. So it's a great Ash to have. I think it's pretty good. I don't think it's as good as some of these other ones on this list, but I'm going to put it at B tier. So that is going to do it for my tier list though, guys. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section down below. If one of your guys' favorites didn't make this list, just know that I tested like 90% of them in the game, and a lot of the ones act very similar to one another. So if there's a spirit that did make this list, it's probably because one of these guys are very similar, or they do the job a little bit better. Let me know your guys' rankings down in the comment section, and that is going to do it for this video, everyone. Hit the subscribe button if you're new here, hit the bell for notifications, and I will talk to you all in the next video.